What happens when you speak up for yourself about unfair treatment on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship? This is Why I Work for 5 Cruise Lines, Part 8. After 15 days of quarantine, I was finally out. I was assigned my new crew cabin, I unpacked all of my suitcases, and it was time to actually start working. Before I could properly return to work, I had a meeting with my activities manager, the cruise director, and the HR manager. The first thing we discussed was the argument between me and my manager. I explained that I didn't have a personal problem with him. We actually met briefly on the adventure before COVID, when he was doing a handover to become the ship's new activities manager, and I remembered us getting on and being quite friendly. But he was very quick to jump in and correct me and make it clear we never actually worked together properly, and so we weren't actually friends. And I remember just thinking, okay, we're not friends then. But I was trying to move forward. Nobody wants to work in hostility. I accepted that maybe I could have handled that phone call more calmly, but I also tried to explain why I've become so frustrated. Because this wasn't simply Jamesy didn't get released when he wanted to, so he threw a hissy fit. As you saw in a previous video, that quarantine had been one problem after another. And then on the day I was finally supposed to get out, I spent 10 hours waiting for an explanation about why I was still stuck in there. So yes, by the time he eventually called me that night, I was angry. I'm not pretending I wasn't, but I wanted them to understand what led up to it. At the end of the meeting, the cruise director asked us both if we were going to be able to work together. And I said, yes, I am a professional. I wanted to put everything behind us and move forward, and genuinely thought that's what we were going to do. Eventually, my manager and the cruise director left, and I stayed behind with the HR manager to go through the quarantine problems in more detail to make sure it was solved for future crew. And honestly, I was a bit surprised by how nonchalant the response was when I went through everything that had happened. From the no-show representatives at the airport, the hotel fiasco, the lack of information, the no water and food situation. Even when I showed him pictures of the food we were served, he just wrote things down in his notebook and said he'd look into it. There was no apology, no real reaction, nothing. I also told him I was concerned because I felt my manager had left that meeting still holding on to some resentment. His advice to me was apologise to him to keep the peace. I smiled and said, okay, I'll do that. The very next day, things got out of hand very quickly. Around midday, my manager called me into the office. Now, this wasn't a private office. It was used by several departments like sports, youth, shore excursions, and there were already other crew members sitting at the computers working away when I walked in. When I entered, he presented me with a page of Royal Caribbean's appearance and uniform guidelines where he'd highlighted everything I was apparently doing wrong. First was my earrings. I was wearing 2 hoops in one ear. Royal Caribbean's rules allowed women to wear a variety of earrings in different shapes and sizes, including hoops, while men were limited to one small singular stud. So he told me mine had to go. I challenged the policy and brought up what would happen if I was non-binary. He stumbled for a moment, but eventually told me I still have to follow the men's rules. And I remember thinking, okay, that definitely needs looking into. Then we got to my name badge. He told me nicknames were not permitted and that I needed to replace Jamesy with James. Earrings, whatever. My name, that one bothered me. I'd had Jamesy on my Royal Caribbean name badge from the very start of my employment 3 years earlier. It's how guests and crew knew me, and it had never been an issue. Carnival, Jamesy. British Airways, Jamesy. Even Disney let me have Jamesy on my name badge, and we all know how strict they can be. Get to work. So I simply said, before I change something that's so personal to me, I'd like to check with HR that I absolutely have to, because I don't understand why it's suddenly a problem after all these years. And immediately he said, so you're refusing to listen to your manager? I said, no, that's not what I said. He then produced a plain piece of paper with a Royal Caribbean logo on it and asked me to sign it to confirm we had this conversation. I'm not joking. He wanted me to sign a blank piece of paper with nothing on it, and I said I wasn't comfortable signing an unofficial document. That's when he swiveled around in his chair and said something along the lines of, oh, you want official documentation? I can give you that. Let me write you a POL. A POL is basically a formal documentation of a conversation that could lead to further disciplinary action if the issue continued. Then he said, take a seat, James. And I knew exactly what he was doing. So I calmly said, please call me Jamesy. He told me he couldn't because company standards didn't allow nicknames. And I said, you can put James on whatever official documentation you need to. I'm just asking you out of respect to please refer to me as Jamesy. And in this really smug way, he said, I'm not allowed to. It's against the rules, James. And that's when I thought, okay, this isn't about a name badge. So I said, okay, I'm going to HR right now. As I stood up to leave, he said, James, I've asked you to sit down and you're ignoring me. So you're refusing to listen to your manager? And I said, you are being so unprofessional. And he immediately came back with, oh, I'm unprofessional. You're the one not listening to your manager. Then in front of everyone in that office, he actually said, "Okay, everyone, I need you to be a witness that James is not listening to his manager." And I said, "You think it's professional to bring this up in front of everyone?" His response was that it wasn't a disciplinary meeting, so it didn't need to be private. And that was the moment I knew what was happening. To me, it felt like he was trying to provoke a reaction in front of an audience so he could then document it. And then, almost perfectly timed, the cruise director walked in and I thought, thank God. The cruise director cleared everybody else out the office so that the three of us could talk privately. We both tried to explain our sides and I outright said I couldn't work with my manager anymore. The cruise director told me to take a break and to continue with my duties and said he'd arrange another meeting with me later that day. So that's exactly what I did. I went back out, hosted trivia, taught my line dance classes, smiled at the guests and carried on being the happy cruise staff host while all of this was happening behind the scenes. Later that evening, I was called into another meeting with the cruise director and HR manager, and this was where things really started to unravel for me. The first thing the HR manager told me was, "I've only got about 20 minutes because I've got somewhere else to be." Then the cruise director told me he spent over an hour and a half speaking to my manager, and my manager was very concerned about the way I'd been reacting to everything. So naturally, my response was, "Well, that's nice. He's had an hour and a half to trash my name and I only get 20 minutes. Probably not helping my case there. But already, I felt like this narrative was starting to form where I was being cast as the irrational employee, while the concerns I was actually raising about my manager were just being overlooked. I was so frustrated because every time I tried to explain something my manager had done, there seemed to be an explanation ready for it. Why was the name badge rule suddenly such an issue when I'd been called Jamesy for years? Well, the company had been really relaxed with the rules during COVID. Now we're returned to service. We just need to be a little bit more stricter. And he was just telling you the rules. Why did he choose to have this conversation in a shared office in front of other crew members? Well, it's a shared office. People are always coming and going. Except nobody was coming and going. They were already sitting there when he asked me to come in. And when I explained that I felt he was clearly retaliating against me, the cruise director said, "I've known him for 2 years. That's just not in his makeup." And that's when I really felt like I was fighting an uphill battle because there was already a clear bias. And interestingly, after my last video, another Royal crew member publicly commented this about the same manager. So clearly I wasn't the only crew member who had a problem with him. So I said, "You've known me for 2 days. All I can say is check my contract reviews and accolades. They're glowing." There was nothing in my record to suggest this was some repeated pattern of behaviour. I mean, I've been nominated for Employee of the Month, I completed a leadership development course with the company, I had positive performance reviews.
Now, apologies about the quality, but it is the original. James is one of our best crew staff. He really has the right attitude. James does the right thing at work and demonstrates honesty and trustworthiness. I can see James as a future leader. He is well liked across the ship and is recognised as a vibrant individual. You get the point.
And here's something I didn't know while I was sitting in that room. I later learned from other crew members that my manager and the cruise director were very good friends. And the cruise director and HR manager were also very close. So finding that out afterwards definitely changed how I looked back at that meeting. I unknowingly walked into the lion's den. And even when I brought up the fact that my manager had asked me to sign a blank unofficial piece of paper, it barely seemed to raise an eyebrow. And then HR asked me again whether I'd apologise to my manager for the quarantine argument like I said I would. I said no, I absolutely did not. And now it felt like that was somehow being held against me. Then the cruise director brought up the fact that earlier I said I couldn't work with my manager anymore. He asked me, "So what are you trying to tell me?" I told him I wanted to transfer. That wasn't an option. So again, if you can't stay and work with your manager, what are you trying to tell me? And that's when I really felt like he was trying to get me to say, I want to quit. But I didn't want to quit. I just wanted the situation to be looked at fairly. I wanted them to be neutral, look at both sides, and actually consider whether what I was telling them had some validity. But in that meeting, that just wasn't happening. At this point, I was just completely overwhelmed. I was so anxious. I hadn't eaten all day. My mouth was so dry, I could barely talk, and I was physically shaking with nerves. I just felt completely powerless. It seemed like they'd already made their minds up and there was nothing more I could say. Eventually, I told them I couldn't continue the conversation anymore because my anxiety was just too high. And that's when they sent me to medical. I explained everything to the doctor and how badly the situation was affecting me. So they prescribed me some Xanax, that was fun, and signed me off work for that night and the following day, where I would have to speak to a shoreside psychologist over the phone. And this is where everything escalated very quickly. The psychologist evaluated me and it was explained to me at the time I was mentally fit. The problem was the internal situation on board that was causing this anxiety, and we were given 5 days to try and resolve it. So silly me, in my head I thought, okay, we're now gonna sit down and find a solution, and honestly I just assumed the most sensible option would be to transfer me and hopefully back to the Odyssey. But apparently there were very different plans being made.